Hi, Igor. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
How's your day going so far?
Not too eventful. Like here it's still morning, kind of like in Vancouver.
Yeah,
Getting the kid ready for daycare, answering some emails,
yeah,
having a coffee.
yeah.
How about you?
I was just filing my taxes before I got here, so yeah, it's been good. I read that you grew up in Sarajevo, which I found interesting, and I wanted to ask you, what was the moment when you realized you wanted to write a film? This film specifically, The White Fortress.
Right. Yeah, so I grew the first 10 years, or rather 9 years of my life were spent in Sarajevo. And then when the war started, I immigrated to Canada when I was 10. So like we spent about a year living in different countries before we immigrated to Canada in that interwar period. And this film in particular was inspired by my continued sort of returns to Sarajevo. I was struck by this inability for the things that used to function in that space to kind of function again. So there was no sense of a shared future. There was no sense of like a generation growing up with like opportunities. It was a very unequal society, and I was struck by how not many things have been done to address that.
Mhm.
If anything, there's this kind of constant uh, uh, kind of fight or flight mechanism in place, right? Like you either fight for that little piece so you can survive in that space, or you leave. And I was kind of fascinated by having a love story that is now it takes place between these two extremes. These extremes that didn't really exist in the old sort of socialist period. There were still poor people and well-off people, but it wasn't as extreme, right? You didn't have these 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 um, uh, these kind of wild capitalism spaces. And I was just struck by, how seemingly um, innocent and sort of middle class people who kind of are just taken down a peg through this sort of new uh, ways of approaching uh, the creation of society, that what the values are, and how that kind of transforms the way people relate to one another, the way they form relationships, the way they fall in love. It has that dimension as well, and the kinds of things that they're kind of forced to do in those situations. So in an alternate universe, Faruk would never be in this situation.
Mm.
Um, but the cards that have been dealt with him were not the greatest ones. So this idea of like love as an act of resistance was like a prevailing theme that I kept going back to. Like love is something that you can uh, that can empower you, that can kind of allow you to see something better over over the hill, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes it's to the detriment of your own sort of well-being, or your survival.
hmm Speaking of love, I like there was a scene where Farouk says to Mona that love is a luxury, and she says it's a feeling that can help you find a sense of belonging. And I wanted to ask you, if you were to defend both of their statements, what would you say? Like defending Farouk's statement that it's a luxury, and then defending Mona's statement that it's something that can help you find a sense of belonging.
Um, I think they're both right in their own way about that space. I think that he's just looking at it in a very sort of cynical way about where how love doesn't really exist in the way that, like, in this kind of romanticized past that it did in this space. It's not to say that parents don't love their children, or like that there isn't, like, grandparents loving their grandkids, and grandkids loving their grandparents and parents. That's not to say that of course that exists. It's
Mhm.
just that it's the value that one places on love is not what it used to be,
Right.
right? Like you're in a space where uh how you're going to survive in that space is far more paramount because it's so hard to survive in that space. We're talking about like 44% of the population of the youth population. 44% is unemployed. So like you finish university, you have no job. So like you have to start calculating how you're going to survive in that space. So that's why it becomes a luxury. So like who you fall in love with is not that important because you can't necessarily survive in that space. You really have to kind of calculate which relationships you're going to be forming, right? And that's where that comes from, like where that kind of line of reasoning comes from. And in her case, because she's sort of in this sort of guarded but very isolated space, these like they call them like golden cages, right? Like zlatni caves in Serbo-Croatia and Bosnia. It's like young people who are like from these affluent families who kind of grow up relatively secluded, like relatively isolated. But they have all the material needs provided, right? But they don't have the emotional needs necessarily, right? So like she comes from that set of experiences. So like she's informed by that. This idea that, you know, things if things are not well in, you know, a relationship, that you can kind of just form a new one. Like things are a bit more disposable. Like they're a bit more fleeting, right? Like they're not permanent.
I found it interesting that they both come from very different worlds, but it seemed like they were both struggling to fit into the worlds that they were in. And so that even that sense of belonging, they seem to find it with each other, even though they come from different worlds. Why do you think that is? Or how would you like elaborate on that?
I think because of the way they met, it was not expected. There was no kind of preconceived notions of like who the person is and what they stand for. I think when you have this concept of chance, right? Like that's like very important in art. It's very important in life, right? Like these kind of chance encounters and how they kind of remove those judgments that we might have if we get time to like figure out who the person is, like ask about them, right? Like you kind of like when you're in this space of like dating familiar people, right? Or like or going in certain circles that you're familiar with, and then you kind of engage with people that might come into contact with that group, right? So you don't, because you don't have like this kind of preconceived notion of who that person is, you're more likely to give them a chance. You're more likely to kind of like allow yourself to kind of dream in a way, because you don't have this additional baggage. You don't have the friends, the family, the expectations of who you should be dating, and I think it's an act of desperation in many ways. This idea of like trying something that you're not entirely familiar with, right? And that is also like what kind of moves them in this direction. And Faruk's story is much darker because he comes at it with like a task, right? Clearly he knows this girl is probably a bit more affluent. The idea that he can actually fulfill the role that's been asked of him, which is to find young women to be groomed for the boss, and he because he's never done it, this idea that he can fall into that darkness is something he's been like actively fighting throughout. And he's trying to kind of grasp some sense of decency, some sense of a feeling that there is a better tomorrow, that there could be a relationship that's more than just like a means to an end. there's like a connection there, that's where judgments are not placed on their early encounters. And because they don't judge each other, because they don't, I mean, they don't judge each other initially, right? They're able to be more free and more open and more true to who they are when they're around each other. So there's less of a script about how they should be behaving, and that's how I approach it. That's why they kind of connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something else that was said by both of them is when I was talking to Faruk, and she said, "Oh, this feels like the start of a fairy tale," and Faruk mentioned, "Oh, it's more like the start of a horror film." And I'm bringing up a lot of dualities. I see that that's something that happens in the movie a lot. How important was it for you to set their romance like against this backdrop of lack and like crime and different things like that? And why was it important to have both of those narratives in one story and how they're interacting with each other?
I think I think it's essentially one narrative. I think like fairy tales, or the fairy tales that we're familiar with, like the Brother Grimm fairy tales, they're horror films. They're not fairy tales. Like they're like Disney takes them and it makes a fairy tale out of them.
Right.
But at the root of a lot of these ancient, 200, 300, 400-year-old tales, they're all horror films. They're fundamentally horror films, and and it's also like I found it as an interesting tool to look at a situation from those two perspectives, of like this kind of like happily ever after versus the and thus their love might last forever in story form, but it cannot last forever in the space that they occupy. So that's how I looked at it. I never looked at it as necessarily fairy tale and horror. I fundamentally think fairy tales are horror.
Right. I think that also plays into just like reality and real life, of how sometimes we have dreams of idealistic dreams of what we want our lives to be like, and then we're hit with reality, and this is like we need to work harder, or things don't always pan out the way we want them to, and it's almost like a reality shock. I know I felt that before, that kind of reality shock. Yeah, so I get that. I really like that. I need to ask you, I noticed that there are a lot of dogs in this film, and I wasn't quite sure why, or like what they symbolize. So I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, there's like a reoccurring motif of like the sort of the neighborhood dog, and like the neighborhood dog being missing, and when Faruk disappears, I guess I'm spoiling the film now. There's this, even though it's sort of sinister, like life goes on. There's a rebirth, and the rebirth in this story is this love that existed between these two, that the even in a destructive act, even in like a sort of a space that's been sort of traumatized, like Sarajevo, like the situation that Faruk has found himself in, and there's this kind of like there's this birthing, this creative process, the rebirth, so to speak, that still is there. And the neighborhood dog does reappear. He reemerges within that space, almost like he like the dog itself is a spiritual animal, like a connection, like a conduit for Faruk, for his dreams and his nightmares. And that's how I approach that. This kind of very this motif of the dogs being both this very empowering element, but also a very destructive element, like the way that the boss threatens him with
Yeah.
the dogs being sent, and how the dogs were used to kill one of the boys in the neighborhood a
Mhm.
few years prior.
Yeah. Um, by the end of the film, when Mona is telling her story, she sets her own fairy tale in the White Fortress. And I know that it's a real place. I Googled it and it looks really beautiful. But I wanted to know from you if growing up, that place, the White Fortress, symbolized something to you, or if it symbolizes something to you now, looking back.
Like one of like I met my partner, like my partner now, close to there, ironically enough. Um, and like we have a family now and stuff. So I think on some like subconscious level, I think that played a role for sure. Um, the other like because the fortress itself is like a military fortification, right? There's this idea of like being watched or watching from it. Um, it's just like a very kind of like um, it's a landmark that was that was historically not that touristy. It was more locals going there to drink and like make out and like because it has a very nice vantage point of the city,
Yeah.
and it's not that easy to reach. Like you have to walk quite a bit uphill to get to it. So like only recently like tourists started using it, and the around the time we were filming they actually put a fence and like you have to pay now to enter.
Yeah.
So before it was like very much a space tied to like the neighborhood, right? It was like even though it was like whenever you look up from the center of the city, you look up, you see the fortress. To get to it was not a trek a lot of tourists took, right? So and it was not maintained that well, right? So now in the last 3 years, so we shot the film in 2019 before the pandemic. In the last 3 years, the space has been reinvented as a place for concerts, for like youth meetups, for like all sorts of events that can kind of accommodate maybe 1,000, 2,000 people, right? So it's being constantly reinvented as like this kind of hopeful space. So like that's kind of the energy that I found really interesting. This kind of like this idea of reinventing, and but like on at the level of like local lore, it doesn't have this kind of fairy tale idea associated with it. It does not have this kind of the story she tells is a story she invented. It's not
Yeah.
a story that's local.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you this question. I'm also an immigrant who's a writer, and I think sometimes there's a tension for me with kind of presenting my home country or home city to people who aren't from there. And I feel almost protective in a way of I want to present this in a good light, but also I want to acknowledge the truth about what's going on at home, hopefully to make it better. And I just wanted to ask you, did you ever feel any kind of tension or protectiveness with writing about your home country and your home city and then presenting it to other people?
This wasn't the first film that I did that, right? So it was, I guess, my third or fourth film where I actually used my birth city as an element within my story. This was just the most sort of Sarajevo oriented because it's a feature film. This film was sort of loosely based on a short film I did called Woman in Purple back in 2010. And that film also dealt with sort of like a moral dilemma of a young drug runner who's put in a situation where he has to make a decision about what he wants to do with his life. And that character is essentially is like a spiritual cousin to Faruk. Like he lives in the same neighborhood. He has like a very sort of similar upbringing, this kind of like middle class that's kind of crumbled. And I originally wanted to make this film in 2014-15 because that's when I thought we would be getting the funding for it. But the film sort of died. Like we couldn't get money for it.
Right.
And it was only when Canada had this program, they joined a program called Vieux that the film was brought back to life. It was like resuscitated. Like we were able to like finally like you could actually make a co-production between Bosnia and Canada, between these smaller countries in Europe. Before it was like historically just France and Belgium and other French-speaking territories, right? Occasionally Ireland. but all these other kind of smaller European countries, it was just not cost effective. It didn't make sense to have these collaborations. So when thinking about the city, like it went through a 6-year transformation while I was writing the script. So at the root of it, I think what happened is I wanted the film to be a little bit more sort of tied to that transformation. Like I wanted the narrative to kind of suggest this kind of transformative breathing space, right? That has both good and bad elements within it. Whereas I believe in the earlier drafts, it was a little bit, it was even more kind of dour. It was more, it had less space for like this optimism that there could be like this better tomorrow.
Right.
So like I think that those 5 years in a way kind of allowed me to reflect on these transitory spaces, like post-war Sarajevo, for example, right? Like this generation didn't go through the war, but their parents did, right? They still carry those scars. Like trauma is intergenerational. So like your parents having PTSD is going to play out in at home, right? Your grandparents having PTSD twice now because of World War II and then the Bosnian Civil War is going to play out, right? Twice over. So I just had more time to reflect, I would say, on how I want to portray my city, and it allowed me to kind of, in a way, what you're saying, like not necessarily push this idea that it's this sort of beautiful, serene place. No, it's a very complicated place. I'm in Canada for a reason. I'm not in. I don't live in Sarajevo. Like in Sarajevo, I would have a hard time existing because, like over there's an element I didn't deal with within this film. There is no such thing as civic identity. It's all ethnicity.
Right.
Like they speak the same language, but like you're Bosniak, Serb, or Croat. Like it's that is so important to like how you even get employed in that space, right? So like even though like you can be surrounded with well-minded, well-intentioned people who don't care about that stuff, and a lot of the people that I know don't care about that stuff. But if you want to gain employment in like a government institution, if you want to gain employment in like in a high school, in a university, any kind of space, it's like, what's your ethnicity and like what's the quota for it? It's a very, very difficult space to exist in. And my cultural background, like my parents are mixed, they're ethnically mixed, so like the two sides were at war with each other. And it makes it really difficult to kind of navigate this idea of seeing myself in that space, but at the same time, it also makes it really difficult not to kind of give a more kind of truthful depiction about what it is like to occupy this transitory space that still hasn't really fully figured out what it is and what it wants to be, while at the same time, you know, like the scars of the war and the constitutional framework that exists in that society hasn't allowed for like a more meaningful dialogue and a more meaningful sort of experience for young people. So yeah, I don't know if I answered that, but yeah, I tried my best.
That's a good answer. Following up on that, I read somewhere on your website, I think, that you'd said sometimes all one can do to move forward is to say goodbye. And this film is the main character's farewell letter to Sarajevo. Do you find that true for yourself as well? Was this kind of I don't know if it's cathartic writing, like letting go, or do you find yourself revisiting kind of your home country and home city?
I think I don't have much to say about the city anymore, right? I think that the reason why I said that or wrote that was I don't have any kind of plans on making another Sarajevo story. I do have ideas about Bosnian set films, But like, because this is my birth city, like I'm not particularly tied to necessarily telling stories just in that space.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the films that I'm developing now are not tied to that space at all. They're tied to Canada. They're tied to, or they're like science fiction, their genre, right? So I think it was cathartic for me to kind of finish this film, and just kind of hope that like young people and the people in that country are able to kind of see the perspective that a filmmaker who kind of breathes that space, but doesn't live there constantly, and how they kind of how they see it, how they romanticize it, or how they sort of make it cynical, right? So it was I think it was just like a need to kind of find that sort of exit, so that I can like focus on some of the other stories I wanted to tell, because I always say like, I think the early work that I kind of engage with, in some ways they're like dealing with trauma, right? Like art is very helpful in almost processing trauma, right? Like they talk about painting and trauma, they talk about music and trauma, right? Similar with film, because this act of writing, you're like, it's almost like you're in therapy with your with these characters, or with these elements that are inspired with your direct or indirect experience, or the observable experience of other people around you. So that's how I approached even this, is this like this idea of like this therapy of almost imagining what life would be in this space if I stayed there as a child,
right?
Or if I stayed there and then had a child, right? Like what would life be like for them, and how they would be shaped by very different forces than the ones that I was shaped by, rather. Yeah.
Yeah. So my final question for you then, and I think you kind of touched on this, is what is your hope for people watching this film, whether they're Bosnian or not? What do you hope they get out of seeing this?
I hope they get hope out of it, actually. This idea that, like, love is an act of resistance. I think that's like the way to summarize it. Like that, like the act of loving is powerful on its own, even if it's directed just at one person.
Yeah. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much for your questions. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.